My parents spent my entire life reminding me that I should know my place. They told me I was the accident, the afterthought, the daughter who would never belong in their world. Years later, they stood in a marble corridor outside a federal appellate courtroom in Richmond, waiting for the panel of judges to arrive. They had no idea that one of those judges sitting on the bench that morning was me. Stick with me while I share my story. And if it moves you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting subscribe, leaving a like, and sharing it with somebody who needs to hear it today. My name is Khalida Voss, and for the first 28 years of my life, I believed everything my parents told me about myself. I believed I was the reason nothing in our house ever felt right. I believed that if I disappeared one morning, the only thing anyone would notice would be the absence of someone to clear the table. We lived in a large brick house on the south side of Charlotte, North Carolina. From the street, the house looked like it belonged in a magazine. The hedges were trimmed into perfect rectangles. The porch swing was always polished. The driveway had 2 cars parked neatly side by side, a black sedan and a silver SUV, both washed every Saturday morning like clockwork. People in the neighborhood thought we were the ideal family. They waved at my father on the sidewalk. They brought my mother banana bread at Christmas and asked her how she kept the garden so green. From the outside, our life was the kind of life you scroll past on a real estate listing and think, that family has nothing to worry about. My father, Barrett Voss, was a commercial real estate broker who was respected by every client he ever met. He spoke slowly, shook hands firmly, and never let anyone see him sweat. He wore the same wool overcoat every winter, charcoal gray with the collar turned up just so. He smelled faintly of coffee and aftershave, even at 9 in the evening. People stood a little straighter when he walked into a room, and he liked that. He built his reputation on small favors remembered and small insults never forgotten. My mother, Imogen, was the kind of woman who brought casseroles to neighbors in aluminum pans and remembered the birthdays of people she had only met once. She laughed easily in public and never said a single unkind word in front of company. She wore pearls to the grocery store. She called her close friends darling and her distant relatives sweetheart, which was a small way of keeping everyone exactly the right distance away. My older brother, Everett, was treated like he could do no wrong. Then there was me, Khalida, the one they did not know how to talk about, the one whose name they remembered only when they needed something. I learned very early that I came last. Not last in a fun way, not the kind of last where everyone cheers anyway. I mean last in the way that small children understand without anyone having to explain it. If there was a hallway that needed vacuuming before guests came over, I was handed the vacuum. If dinner had to be served, I stood in the kitchen while everyone else sat at the table. I would carry the plates out one by one, refill the water glasses, and clear the dishes after the last person was finished eating. No one ever asked how my day at school had gone. No one asked what I was reading or what my favorite subject was. The only time my name left my mother's mouth was when she needed something carried, cleaned, or fetched. By the time I was 9 years old, I had learned to walk quietly through my own house. I had learned that the sound of my footsteps could make my father frown if I was in the wrong room at the wrong time. I remember one afternoon in particular. I was 8 years old, and I had just finished coloring a picture I was proud of. It was a drawing of our house, with crooked windows and a purple door I had invented because we did not actually have a purple door. The grass in my drawing was a bright green I had never seen outside, and the sky was the color of a cotton ball. I ran into the living room to show my mother. She was on the phone with one of her friends, laughing about something I did not understand. I tugged at the hem of her blouse and held up the drawing. She looked down at it for half a second, gave me a small smile that did not reach her eyes, and said, "That is lovely, sweetheart. Now run along and wash the blueberries for your father's snack." She turned back to her phone call before I had even dropped my hand back to my side. I walked back to my room, slid the drawing under my mattress, and lay there for a long time, listening to the clock on my dresser tick. After that afternoon, I did not show anyone else another picture for almost 10 years. At school, I tried harder than anyone I knew. I stayed up past midnight writing book reports. I asked the teachers for extra worksheets, then asked for more. I read the encyclopedia entries the other kids ignored. I told myself that if I could just bring home a certificate, a trophy, or a letter of praise, my parents would finally look at me the way they looked at Everett. I remember the night I brought home my first report card with straight A's. I had walked into the kitchen holding it like it was a winning lottery ticket. My father glanced at it over the top of his coffee cup and said, "That is what is expected, Khalida. That is not something we celebrate." My mother smiled politely, set the paper down on the counter next to the salt shaker, and changed the subject to ask Everett whether he had remembered to text his college roommate. I stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a few seconds, holding nothing in my hands, and then I walked quietly back to my room and closed the door without making a sound. I kept telling myself that if I just tried harder, things would change. I helped plan every family birthday. I mowed the lawn without being asked. I wrapped the Christmas presents, wrote the cards, decorated the tree, and baked the cookies for the school fundraiser. I followed every rule in the house without arguing, without rolling my eyes, without once raising my voice. And I thought, in the quiet, hopeful way that children think, that being patient would one day earn me the love I was missing. Instead, it only earned me more work. The harder I worked, the more invisible I became. I learned the strange math of a house that only counts the children it admires. I could mop the kitchen floor twice in one day and no one would notice, but if Everett forgot to take out the trash once, my father would mention it at dinner as proof that my brother could not be bothered. Family gatherings were where the truth really showed itself. Every Thanksgiving, every Easter, every 4th of July, the relatives would crowd into our house. They would laugh with my parents in the living room. They would hug my father and shake his hand. They would pile praise on Everett for choices he had not even made yet, calling him brilliant, calling him a natural, calling him the future of the family. I would float from one room to the next with a tray of deviled eggs or a basket of clean napkins, refilling drinks, brushing crumbs off the sofa, taking out the trash twice during a single afternoon. I felt more like hired help than a daughter. No one questioned it because that was simply how things had been for as long as anyone could remember. Family, I learned, is not always the people who protect you. Sometimes it is the people who teach you, slowly and without meaning to, that you are not worth protecting. I remember one particular summer afternoon. My cousin Marigold had come over with her mother for a barbecue. We were about the same age, and for a brief moment I thought we might be allowed to play together. My mother handed me a stack of plastic plates and said, "Make sure everyone gets a napkin, Khalida, and don't forget the silverware tray." My cousin looked at me with a question in her eyes, and I just smiled politely at her and started setting the table. I was 12 years old. I did not get to play that afternoon. I did not get to sit at the table with the other kids either. I stood near the kitchen doorway, in case someone needed something, until the last guest left. When Marigold walked past me on her way out, she whispered, "I'm sorry." I told her it was fine. I did not know then how much that small apology was going to mean to me years later. After one Christmas dinner, as I quietly carried empty plates toward the kitchen sink, my father stepped into the hallway and blocked my path. He looked down at me with the same cold expression he used when he was angry at a client. In front of my aunt, my uncle, and 2 of his business partners, he said, "Know your place, Khalida. You will never be one of us." Then he walked back into the dining room and picked up his glass of wine as if nothing had happened. I stood there with a stack of plates in my hands and felt the room go completely silent. I walked into the kitchen, set the dishes in the sink, and stood at the counter for several minutes without moving. I was 13 years old, and I had already learned that love in my family was something you earned by being born the right way. Those words stayed with me for far longer than they should have. They followed me through high school. They followed me into college applications. They followed me into every decision I made during the years I still thought I could earn my parents' respect. They became a quiet voice in the back of my head that whispered every time I tried something new, "Do not get too comfortable, Khalida. You will never be one of them." As I grew older, I stopped expecting kindness. I focused on doing whatever they asked because I believed it was my duty. Whenever an opportunity came for me to do something on my own, my parents had a reason ready. The family needed me close to home, they would say. "A good daughter puts her family first," they would remind me. They were skilled at making me feel guilty for even thinking about what I wanted for myself. They were so skilled that I started to feel guilty about my dreams while I was still awake in the middle of dreaming them. During my senior year of high school, one of my teachers, a woman named Mrs. Garza, encouraged me to apply for a scholarship at a respected university several states away. I did not tell my parents. I filled out the application at the public library because I did not want them to see the paperwork. I wrote the essays at midnight, with the lamp on my desk turned down low so the light would not creep under my door. I gathered recommendations from 3 teachers who had watched me work harder than any other student in their classes. When the acceptance letter arrived, with a financial package that would cover nearly everything, I sat on my bed and cried for the first time in years. I thought it was the moment everything was finally going to change. Before I could tell anyone, my father sat me down at the kitchen table and explained that the family needed me close to home. He sat with his arms crossed, his coffee steaming in front of him, and he said, "Leaving would be selfish, Khalida. We have given you a roof and a name. You do not get to walk away from that." My mother held my hand and told me that a good daughter always stays where her parents need her. Her voice was gentle. Her eyes were kind. That was the worst part of it, because I could not be angry at her when she sounded like that. I turned down the scholarship. I did not tell any of my teachers why. I did not tell Mrs. Garza that her encouragement had been for nothing. I told myself that family came first, even when the family did not seem to care whether I came at all. The same pattern repeated itself through every year that followed. I missed road trips with my friends because I was needed at home. I missed birthday dinners, wedding showers, and weekend getaways because there was always a reason I had to stay behind. Slowly, my friends stopped inviting me. They loved me, but they had learned that my answer would always be no. The walls of my world kept getting smaller, and I accepted it because I thought that was simply how life was supposed to look for someone like me. Everett never worried about any of it. He spent the money our parents gave him without thinking twice. He took out loans he had no intention of paying back. He started one venture after another, and each one failed louder than the last. Every time something went wrong, my parents looked at me instead of him. They asked me to fix it. Sometimes I used my own savings, the small amount I had managed to set aside from my part-time job at the library, to cover one of his debts. Other times I spent entire weekends organizing paperwork, calling angry suppliers, drafting apology letters I had to sign in my own name. I met with people who had lost money because of Everett's choices, and I took the blame so he would not have to. No one thanked me afterward. They simply acted as if I had done what I was supposed to do, the way a piece of furniture holds up a shelf and never gets noticed for doing it. I once sat on the edge of my bed after one of those weekends and opened my bank app, just to count what was left. It was not much. I remember the number, even now. Whenever I looked tired, or whenever I asked why everything always fell on me, my mother placed her hand on my shoulder with that gentle smile she used in front of guests. She would remind me that I owed the family everything because they had given me a home and raised me. She made me feel guilty for even thinking about my own future. After hearing that sentence so many times that I had lost count, I started to believe it. I started to believe that wanting anything for myself was the same as betraying the people who had kept me alive. The only person who ever treated me differently was my grandmother. Her name was Rosalind Voss, and she had been a federal prosecutor for almost 30 years before she retired. She had a small apartment across town with too many bookshelves and not enough lamps. She used to invite me over on Saturday afternoons. We would sit at her kitchen table and drink tea out of cups that had small flowers painted on the inside. She never asked me to vacuum. She never asked me to bring her anything from the other room. Instead, she asked me what I was thinking. She asked me what I had read that week. She asked me what I wanted my life to look like when nobody was telling me how to live it. She once told me, "Khalida, kindness without boundaries is not love. It is surrender. You have been surrendering yourself for a long time, and I do not think you even know it." I did not know what to say to that, so I just nodded and sipped my tea. But those words stayed with me long after the cup was empty. She reminded me, again and again, that kindness should never mean giving up your own life. She told me that a person who gives until they disappear has given in the wrong direction. She told me she was proud of me, even when my own parents could not find the time to say it. She told me she was proud of me, even when my own parents had stopped looking in my direction at all. She used to keep my school pictures in a small silver frame on her bookshelf, even the ones where my eyes looked tired and my smile looked a little too careful. One Saturday, when I was about 19, I sat at her kitchen table and told her that I had no idea who I was anymore. I told her that every time I tried to do something for myself, I felt like I was stealing time from the family. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she pushed her teacup to the side and looked straight at me. She said, "You are not stealing time, child. You are stealing yourself back. There is a difference, and one of these days you are going to have to choose which one you want to keep." I did not understand the full weight of her words that day. I only nodded and promised I would think about it. I think about that conversation almost every week now. When she passed away in the spring of my 26th year, I felt as if a window had closed inside me. I could not imagine my life without those Saturday afternoons. I kept waiting for her to call and tell me she was heading to the kitchen to put the kettle on. She never did. I sat beside her bed the night before she died, and I held her hand, which was smaller than I remembered. She squeezed my hand and said something I did not understand at the time. She said, "Do not be afraid of what I left you, Khalida. It was always meant to be yours." I thought she was talking about a piece of jewelry or one of the books on her shelf. I did not realize that she had been trying to protect me in ways I could not yet see. Not long after her funeral, my parents became strangely secretive whenever her name came up. They changed the subject when I asked simple questions about her belongings. They got quiet when I asked about the letters she used to send me on my birthday. They told me those letters had been lost in a move years ago. I did not realize it then, but they were hiding something important. I continued trusting them, never imagining that the biggest betrayal of my life was already waiting just ahead. Even now, when I think about that stretch of weeks after the funeral, I remember how quiet the house felt, and how that quiet did not feel like peace. It felt like a door being closed a little at a time. A few days after my grandmother's funeral, the family gathered at a lawyer's office in Uptown Charlotte for the reading of her will. I almost did not go, because I already knew how these family meetings usually ended for me. I was used to sitting in the back of the room, used to being the one who arrived first and left last, used to being ignored. Still, I wanted to be there. I wanted to honor the woman who had been the only real family I had ever had. I sat near the back of the conference room while relatives filled the seats around me. No one spoke to me except for a polite greeting from the lawyer, a younger man I had not met before. Before the meeting could even start, my father looked across the room and shook his head in disappointment. He said he could not believe I had come, knowing how difficult this day was for everyone else. Then he accused me of only caring about my grandmother's money. He said I should be ashamed of myself for showing up. His words caught me completely by surprise. I had not asked my grandmother for anything in the last decade of her life. I was there because I missed her. Before I could answer, Everett laughed loudly. He told the whole room that I was acting like I belonged in the family. He joked that I should remember I had always been the family's helper, not an equal. A few relatives looked uncomfortable, but no one defended me. Some looked away. Others studied the pattern on the carpet. My cousin Marigold, who had witnessed the barbecue years ago, suddenly found her phone very interesting. I could see her thumbs tapping the screen, although I doubted there was anyone she needed to text at that moment. That silence hurt almost as much as the insults. I felt every eye in the room on me, and I wished the floor would open up and swallow me completely. The lawyer tried to continue the meeting, but I could no longer focus on the words being spoken. My chest felt heavy, and my throat was tight with the effort of holding back tears. I slowly stood up. I apologized for interrupting. I walked toward the door with my head down, my hands trembling at my sides. No one tried to stop me. No one called my name. My father did not even look up from the papers in front of him. Everett went back to talking to one of his friends on the phone. My mother stared at her fingernails like they were the most interesting thing she had seen in years. As I stepped outside the building, I realized I had spent years hoping my family would one day treat me differently. At that moment, I accepted that nothing was ever going to change. I drove home with tears running down my face. I believed I had lost the only person who had truly cared about me, and her final goodbye had ended with yet another humiliation. I sat in my small apartment that evening, looking out the window at the street lamps flickering on one by one, and I thought seriously for the first time about whether I should leave everything behind and start over somewhere no one knew my name. Just as the sun disappeared behind the tree line, my phone rang. I almost let it go to voicemail because I did not have the energy to speak with anyone. The number was unfamiliar, but something in the back of my mind told me to answer. A calm voice introduced himself and asked if I was Khalida Voss. After I quietly said yes, he told me his name was Wendell Pryor. He said he had been my grandmother's attorney for many years. He said there was something very important we needed to discuss and that it could not wait another day. At that moment, I had no idea that one phone call was about to change my entire life forever. The next morning, I met Wendell Pryor at his small law office a few blocks from the courthouse in Uptown Charlotte. He welcomed me kindly and asked me to sit down. His office smelled faintly of old books and lemon wood polish, the way law offices sometimes do when the lawyer inside them has been in the same place for 30 years. His voice was steady and calm, and for the first time in a very long while, I felt like someone was speaking to me with genuine respect. He placed a large manila folder on the desk in front of me and said my grandmother had trusted him with something she wanted me to receive under very specific conditions. She had told him, before her final days that the time had finally come for me to know the truth. Wendell explained that my grandmother had quietly created a private legal trust years before she died. She had done it in secret because she was afraid my parents would try to interfere if they ever found out. The trust included financial security, but Wendell said that was only the smallest part of what my grandmother had wanted to leave behind. More important than the money were the letters, the records, and the legal documents she had carefully collected over many years. He handed me the first letter, written in my grandmother's own handwriting. As I read it, tears filled my eyes for an entirely different reason this time. She wrote that she had watched me grow into a kind and honest young woman. She admitted she had seen the way my parents treated me for years. She wanted me to know that I had never deserved their harsh words or their coldness. She apologized for not being able to protect me more while she was alive. She said she had done what she could, quietly in case one day I needed proof of what I had lived through. She said she knew I would need that proof to believe my own memories. She wrote that she had kept every report card I had ever brought to her apartment, every program from every school play I had ever appeared in, even the one where I had played a small tree in the third-grade production of An Autumn Story. She said she had kept every single one because she had known, even then, that I was someone worth paying attention to. Wendell then opened a second folder filled with copies of handwritten letters, school papers, business records, and printed emails. He showed me proof that several opportunities had been taken away from me without my knowledge. There were letters from law schools that had accepted my application, with scholarships attached. There were internship offers from prestigious firms in 3 different cities. There was a recommendation letter from a sitting federal judge who had written that I was the most promising student he had supervised in 20 years. Some of those offers had been answered with forged letters saying I was not interested. Others had simply disappeared, intercepted before they ever reached me. My parents had made sure I never even knew those chances existed. Wendell explained that my grandmother had quietly investigated after noticing that too many strange things happened whenever I earned any kind of recognition. She discovered that Barrett and Imogen were afraid I might become more successful than Everett. Instead of encouraging both of their children, they chose to hold me back so their son would always remain the center of attention. The records showed they had even paid a small fee years ago to a man who helped them intercept certain mail before it reached our house. The fee receipts were in the folder, with dates with signatures with my father's handwriting on the back of one envelope. I remember sitting very still in that chair, listening to Wendell describe each document. I did not cry. I did not interrupt. I asked him to slow down so I could read along. He nodded, and we went through them one by one. There were postmarked envelopes that had never arrived. There were emails sent from my father's account to a service that handled sensitive correspondence redirection, with a small monthly invoice attached. There were transcripts of 3 phone calls between my mother and a school counselor, asking which of my awards could quietly be downplayed so that my brother's college applications would not be overshadowed. I read every word, and I felt something inside me rearrange itself, like bones that had been out of place for a long time finally being set in the right position. Hearing those words broke something inside me that had been holding on for a long time. But at the same time, the words lifted a weight I had carried since I was a child. I finally understood that my failures had not always been my own. Many doors had been closed before I had the chance to even reach for the handle. My grandmother's final letter ended with a simple message. She told me to stop blaming myself for the choices other people had made. She wanted me to build a life based on my own dreams, instead of living under someone else's control. As I carefully folded the letter and placed it back in its envelope, I realized my entire life had been built on lies. For the first time, I also realized that my future no longer belonged to my parents. It finally belonged to me. After leaving Wendell's office, I spent several days thinking about what I wanted to do next. For years, my life had been controlled by other people. Now I finally had the chance to make my own decisions. I could have stayed and argued with my parents. I could have tried to expose everything they had done at every family dinner, at every holiday, at every Sunday gathering. But I knew that path would only keep me tied to the past. I wanted something different. I wanted something new. I wanted to find out who Kalita Voss was when nobody was telling her where to stand. I packed my belongings, left my hometown, and moved to another state where no one knew me or my family. I had exactly enough from the trust to support myself for a little over a year if I lived carefully. It was not easy starting over, but for the first time every choice belonged entirely to me. I rented a small studio apartment in a quiet neighborhood. I bought my groceries with my own money. I set my own alarm clock. I walked to the library on Saturday mornings instead of going to my grandmother's kitchen table. Each small act of independence felt like a small piece of healing. The first morning I woke up in that apartment, with no one asking me to set the table or wash the dishes, I lay in bed for almost 20 minutes just listening to the silence. It was the best silence I had heard in years. I used the inheritance carefully and never wasted a dollar of it. Instead of buying things, I invested in my education. I enrolled in a respected college and studied harder than I had ever studied before. Every class reminded me that I had always been capable. The opportunities that had been denied were finally in front of me, and I refused to waste them. I took extra courses during the summer. I argued cases in the mock trial program. I clerked at a small legal aid office on weekends, helping people who could not afford representation. I remember one winter evening when I sat in the back of the legal aid office after everyone had gone home, looking through a stack of files, and I realized that I was doing exactly what my grandmother had done for 30 years. I smiled in that empty office, and I let myself feel that feeling, just for a few minutes before I went back to work. After earning my degree, I applied to law school and was accepted with a full scholarship. The work was difficult. There were many nights when I barely slept because I was preparing for exams or reading case files until my eyes burned. Even when I felt exhausted, even when I thought about giving up and finding an easier path, I remembered my grandmother's words and kept moving forward. I remember one particular night during my second year. I had been studying for almost 13 hours. My roommate had already gone to bed. I sat at my desk and read the same paragraph 5 times without understanding it, and I started to cry. Not because the material was hard, but because I was tired of pretending I was not tired. I closed the book. I put my head down on my arms. And after a few minutes, I picked the book back up again, because that was what people like me had to do. People like me had to keep going because nobody was going to come in and tell us we had done enough. Years passed, and I slowly built a career based on honesty, discipline, and respect for the law. Every position I accepted taught me something valuable. I never looked for shortcuts. I never asked for special treatment. I earned every promotion through hard work. I worked as an assistant district attorney, then as a private defense attorney, then as a clerk for a circuit court judge who later became one of my strongest mentors. He never knew about my family, and I never told him. He simply saw someone who showed up prepared, every single morning, rain or shine, sick or tired. He once told me, after a long hearing, "Khalida, you do not look for the easy answer. You look for the right one. That is rarer than you think." Eventually, after many years of dedication, I was nominated and confirmed as a judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. It was one of the proudest moments of my life. I wish my grandmother had been there to see it, because she was the first person who ever believed I could become more than the world expected. The day I took my oath of office, I stood in front of the flag with my right hand raised, and I thought about the girl who had once been told she would never be one of them. I thought about her as I repeated the words of the oath. I thought about her as I sat down for the first time behind the bench. I also thought about Wendell Pryor, who had driven 200 miles to be there, and who was sitting in the second row, smiling the way he smiled the very first morning I had walked into his office. I never contacted my parents during those years. I changed my address, focused on my work, and lived a quiet life. As far as they knew, I had disappeared into a fog after leaving Charlotte. They believed I had failed because they could not imagine me succeeding without their permission. They told relatives I had gone off to live with a friend in another state. They told friends I had taken a modest job and was struggling. They did not ask after me in any serious way, because asking would have required them to admit that I might have been doing something worth doing. While I was building my future, my family's life was moving in the opposite direction. Barrett continued trusting Everett with important financial decisions, even though Everett had never once learned from his mistakes. One risky investment followed another. Loans became larger, profits became smaller, and people slowly lost confidence in the family business. Financial problems that had once been hidden behind polished smiles became impossible to ignore. Lawsuits started appearing in the local news. Longtime business partners walked away. The house that had once looked so perfect from the street began to look tired and worn. The hedges grew out a little too far. The porch swing was no longer polished. One former employee, a woman named Della, had even gone to the local paper to describe a meeting in which Everett had laughed when she raised concerns about the books. That article was the first time I had seen my brother's name in print. It was the first time I had seen his name attached to a sentence that ended with the word fraud. I read it twice, and then I closed my laptop. and I went back to work. I did not call my parents. I did not send a letter. I had learned by then that there are some fires you cannot put out for other people. You can only make sure that you are not standing too close when they finally burn through the last wall. I occasionally heard small pieces of news through public records, but I stayed focused on my own life. I had worked too hard to let the past reach into my present again. My parents never once imagined that the daughter they had dismissed for so many years was now sitting on one of the highest benches in the federal court system. They still believed I had no place in their world. They still believed I was the girl who could not even keep a scholarship. Soon enough, they would discover that life had changed in ways none of them could have imagined. Several years passed without a single message from my parents. I accepted that chapter of my life was over and gave all my attention to my work. Then one evening, my phone rang while I was finishing paperwork at home. I almost ignored the call because I did not recognize the number. When I answered, I immediately recognized my father's voice. He sounded older and far less confident than I remembered. He asked how I had been and spoke as if nothing had ever happened between us. It felt strange hearing him act so friendly after everything he had done. He said, "Khalida, it has been a long time. I hope you are doing well. We have not been in touch, but I have been thinking about you." I sat down slowly in the chair next to my desk and listened to him fill the next 3 minutes with sentences I had heard him use on his business clients. He was warming me up. He was trying to sound like a concerned father before he brought up whatever it was he actually wanted. I knew the rhythm of his voice from 100 Saturday mornings when he coached me on which fork to use at dinner for the people he wanted to impress. That rhythm did not belong to me, and I knew it. I listened quietly while he explained that the family had been facing difficult times. Business losses had become impossible to recover from. Creditors were demanding payment. Several civil lawsuits had been filed against the company. He said Everett had been indicted in a federal case involving wire fraud and money laundering. He said the case could change the rest of Everett's life. Before ending the call, he asked if we could meet because the family needed my help. He paused at the end, as if expecting me to fill the silence with the forgiveness he had never actually earned. A few days later, I agreed to meet them at a quiet restaurant near the courthouse in my new city. When I arrived, both of my parents were already waiting at a corner table. My mother stood up with tears in her eyes and hugged me before I could react. She said she missed me. She wished we had never grown apart. Her words sounded kind, but something about them did not feel sincere. I sat down across from them and ordered a glass of water I did not really want. I watched their faces as they looked at me for any sign of the daughter they remembered, and I could tell they did not see her. They saw someone who had been gone long enough to become unfamiliar. I could see it in the way my father's eyes searched my face, then dropped to the menu, then came back again. He was trying to figure out what I had become, and the answer was not the one he had prepared for. My father spoke first. He kept his voice low, the way men in his business used to speak when they were about to ask for something large. He told me about the unpaid debts. He told me about the interest piling up. He told me about the threats he had been receiving from people my brother had once called friends. My mother nodded along and added her own details, the way she always had until the story felt like a duet they had practiced. Then my mother said gently, "Family has to take care of family, Khalida. You have always been the dependable one. We are counting on you now." She reached across the table and put her hand on top of mine. I let her hand stay there for a moment, but I did not turn my palm up to hold it back. I thought about all the times I had turned my palm up. I thought about all the times it had cost me something I could not get back. They never asked about my life. They never asked what I had accomplished over the years. They never asked where I lived now, or who I had become, or whether I was happy. They only talked about their own problems and what they hoped I could do for them. I realized they had not changed at all. They simply believed I had somehow found enough money to rescue them. I remained calm and respectful. I did not argue. I did not remind them of the past. I also chose not to tell them anything about my career. The less they knew, the better. I knew that revelation would come in its own time, in its own place, with all the consequences it deserved. Near the end of the meeting, my father mentioned that Everett's case would soon be heard by a federal appellate panel. He said the judges assigned to the case would have enormous influence over the outcome. Then he looked at me and asked if I would attend the hearing to show that the family was united during such a difficult time. He said it would mean a great deal to his son. He said it would give Everett the strength to face the courtroom. He did not know that I would not just be in the courtroom. He did not know that I would be one of the 3 people sitting on the bench that morning. He did not know that the daughter he had asked to come in for support was the very person whose face Everett would have to look up to when he asked for mercy. I looked at both of them for a long moment before quietly agreeing. They seemed relieved. They believed I had finally decided to stand beside them again. As we left the restaurant, my mother smiled with confidence, certain that everything would soon work out in their favor. Neither of them had any idea why I had actually accepted the invitation. They believed they were bringing back the daughter they had once ignored. In reality, they were walking toward a moment that would force them to face the truth they had spent years refusing to see. The morning of the hearing arrived, and the courthouse was already busy when my family arrived. Lawyers walked through the marble halls carrying heavy files. Reporters waited outside the courtroom with cameras and notebooks. People quietly filled the wooden benches inside. The case against Everett had received a great deal of public attention because of how many ordinary people had lost their savings because of his schemes. There were retirees in the gallery who had trusted the family name with the money they had set aside for their grandchildren. There were small business owners who had been convinced to invest their savings. There were former employees whose pension contributions had disappeared into the same hole. My parents entered with serious expressions, but I could still see confidence in my father's face. He greeted a few people he recognized from his old business circles and acted as though the family name still carried the same influence it once had. He shook hands with a man who used to be his accountant. He nodded to a woman who used to bring us cookies at Christmas. He introduced my mother with the same practiced smile he had used 100 times at fundraisers and charity galas. My brother walked in between his two lawyers, his chin lifted, his eyes scanning the courtroom for anyone he recognized who might still believe in him. I watched everything from a private chambers area, preparing for the hearing just as I had done many times before. No one in my family knew I was there. I had asked my clerk to keep my robe pressed. I had reviewed the briefs twice. I had marked the key pages. I had even written out a series of questions I planned to ask during oral argument, the same way I always did, because every case deserved the same level of preparation no matter whose name appeared in the caption. I sat behind the closed door of chambers for almost 20 minutes before the hearing began, just breathing, just reminding myself that the woman I had been and the woman I had become were about to meet in the same room at the same time. A court officer announced that the hearing was about to begin and asked everyone to take their seats. The room became completely silent. A moment later, the officer called for everyone to rise as the panel of judges entered the courtroom. I walked through the side door wearing my black judicial robe and took my place behind the center chair on the bench. As I looked across the courtroom, my eyes met my father's. The color drained from his face as if someone had pulled a plug. My mother stared at me without moving, one hand pressed flat against the wooden railing in front of her. Everett looked completely shocked. He actually sat down in his chair a little too quickly, the way people do when their legs stop working properly. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. He turned to one of his lawyers and whispered something. The lawyer shook his head slightly, as if to say, "Do not say a word." For a few long seconds, the entire room remained silent. Even the lawyers at their tables had stopped shuffling papers. People in the gallery looked at one another, understanding something important was happening even if they did not know exactly what it was. My parents had come into that courtroom expecting to be seen by the daughter they had dismissed. Instead, they were about to be seen, for the first time in their lives, by someone they could not dismiss. Then the hearing officially began. The attorneys introduced themselves, and the court followed its normal procedures. When it was time for the defense to speak, Everett's lawyer stood and said, "Your Honor." I had heard those words 1,000 times before in other rooms. Hearing them in this room, while watching my own family realize what was happening, was something I had never expected to experience. My father lowered his head slightly before speaking. For the first time in my life, he addressed me with respect because the courtroom required it. He could no longer order me around. He could no longer speak down to me. Inside those walls, I was not the daughter he had ignored for years. I was the judge responsible for making sure the law was followed fairly. My mother looked as though she wanted to say something personal, but she knew she could not. The courtroom was not a place for family arguments or emotional speeches. It was a place where facts mattered more than reputation. Throughout the hearing, I remained calm and professional. I treated both sides equally. I never allowed my personal history to affect my responsibilities. I asked clear questions. I listened carefully to every answer. I followed the law exactly as I had sworn to do when I took my oath of office. My family finally understood that my position had been earned through years of quiet, hard work, not through luck, not through anyone else's help. At one point during the hearing, I asked Everett's lawyer a question about a particular document that had been entered into evidence. The document was a forwarded email in which Everett had personally approved a misleading quarterly report. The lawyer tried to deflect, but I asked the question again, slightly differently the way judges learn to do when they want a clear answer on the record. Everett looked down at the table in front of him. He did not look back up for the rest of the morning. After that exchange, my mother closed her eyes for a long moment, and my father put his hand over his mouth the way men do when they are trying very hard not to say something out loud. As the hearing continued, I remembered the words my father had spoken years ago after that Christmas dinner. He had told me to know my place because I would never be one of them. Sitting on the bench that morning, I finally understood something he never had. I had found my place long ago. It was simply far higher than he had ever believed possible. As the case moved forward, every decision had to be based on facts, not feelings. I reminded myself of the promise I had made when I accepted my appointment. My duty was to protect the law and treat every person equally, no matter who they were or what their last name happened to be. My family was now standing in front of me, but they would receive the same fair process as anyone else. The lawyers presented financial records, business contracts, bank statements, and witness testimony. Everything was carefully examined before becoming part of the official record. Day after day, the evidence became clearer. The documents showed that Everett had approved false financial reports and signed papers that misled investors. Several witnesses confirmed that he had ignored repeated warnings from his own employees and advisors. One analyst, a quiet man with watery eyes, told the court that he had raised concerns at quarterly meetings for 2 years. He had been told, each time, that the family knew what it was doing. The mistakes were not accidents. They were choices that caused serious harm to thousands of ordinary people who had trusted him with their retirement savings. My name was never connected to any of those actions because I had left years before those events took place. There was no question about my involvement. I had nothing to do with the business or the decisions that had led to the case. My record was clean. My conscience was clear. During one hearing, my father asked for permission to speak directly to the court. He began talking about our family. He said they had already suffered enough. He described difficult times and asked for mercy instead of focusing on the legal issues before the panel. He spoke as if charm and sympathy could replace evidence. He spoke the way he had spoken in business meetings for decades, the way men like him speak when they think words alone can move mountains. I listened patiently until he finished. Then I calmly explained that personal stories could not replace facts, and that every decision would be made according to the law. The courtroom became silent as everyone understood that the case would not be influenced by emotion or family connections. My mother looked disappointed, but she said nothing. She finally realized that I could not be controlled the way I had been controlled years ago. I felt no satisfaction in watching them struggle. I also felt no anger. Carrying hate for so many years would have only hurt me. Letting go of that pain had allowed me to build a better life, and I was not willing to lose that peace now. I simply continued doing my job with honesty and respect. The people inside the courtroom watched everything carefully. They knew my relationship with the defendants had become public by then. Yet they also saw that I never showed favoritism. They saw that I never asked for revenge. I followed the same rules I would have followed in any other case. Even the attorneys on both sides recognized that the hearing had remained fair from beginning to end. One of the prosecutors, a man I had worked beside in another lifetime, nodded slightly at me from his table during a recess. That small nod said more than any speech could have. It said, "You are still one of us, even now." By the time the evidence had been fully presented, many people in the courtroom had reached the same conclusion. The daughter who had been ignored, criticized, and pushed aside for most of her life had grown into the most honorable person in the family. My parents had spent years believing they had chosen the stronger child. In the end, character mattered far more than pride, money, or reputation. That truth was now impossible for anyone to deny. After the appellate ruling was issued, I returned to my normal work and expected life to become quiet again. I had no interest in talking about my family or explaining the past to anyone. I believed the legal chapter was closed, and I wanted to move forward. A few weeks later, Wendell Pryor contacted me again and told me he was ready to carry out the final part of my grandmother's instructions. She had left behind several sealed letters that were meant to be shared with certain members of our extended family only after everything else had been settled. Wendell carefully followed her wishes and delivered copies of the letters along with the documents she had collected over many years. The letters described everything my grandmother had witnessed while she was alive. She wrote about the unfair way my parents had treated me from childhood into adulthood. She explained how they had ignored my achievements, taken away important opportunities, and made me believe I was worth less than my brother. She also described how they had hidden information about the inheritance she wanted me to receive. Every statement was supported by records, letters, and official documents that she had saved. No one could dismiss her words as guesses or opinions. The evidence spoke for itself. As relatives finished reading everything, many of them were shocked. Some admitted they had believed the stories my parents had told for years. They thought I had left the family because I was selfish or ungrateful. They never realized I had been carrying the weight of years of unfair treatment in silence. One by one, a few of them reached out to me. Some called. Others wrote letters. They apologized for believing things that were not true, and for never once asking me what had really happened. My cousin Marigold, who had been at the will reading all those years ago, sent me a long letter in which she admitted she had known something was wrong and had been too afraid to say anything. She apologized for the barbecue. She apologized for the will reading. She asked if I would be willing to talk someday. I wrote back and told her I appreciated the apology and that I wished her well. I also told her that I was not yet ready to talk, but that someday perhaps I would be. I accepted their apologies without anger, because I knew they had only ever seen one side of the story. My parents could no longer deny the truth. Too many people had seen the letters and the documents. Their excuses slowly disappeared because every question had a clear answer supported by clear proof. The respect they had once enjoyed within the family faded away. It was not because I tried to embarrass them. I never spoke against them in public. I never asked anyone to turn away from them. I never even raised my voice about the matter. The truth had done all of that work on its own, the same way water does its work on stone. It does not argue. It just keeps coming, year after year, until the stone is shaped into something it never asked to be. I often thought about my grandmother during those days. Even after her passing, she had found a way to protect me and to restore my name. She knew that real justice was not built on revenge, but on honesty. She knew that patience would be the most powerful weapon of all. Looking back, I realized she had given me something far more valuable than an inheritance. She had given me the chance to finally live without carrying the blame for things that had never been my fault. For the first time in my life, the people around me knew who I truly was, and I no longer had to prove my worth to anyone. Months passed after everything settled, and life slowly became quiet in a way I had never experienced before. One morning, I drove to the cemetery to visit my grandmother's grave. The weather was calm, and the sky looked clear, almost as if the world was giving me a private moment of peace. I stood in front of her headstone for a long time without speaking. There were so many things I wished I could tell her, but instead I simply stayed there and let the silence speak for me. I thought about everything that had happened since the day I left Charlotte. The pain, the confusion, the long years of rebuilding myself all came back to me at once. But this time, the memories did not feel heavy. They felt like a story that had finally reached its ending. I realized that for most of my life I had been trying to find my place in a world that never truly saw me. I had believed I was meant to stay in the background, to accept whatever others decided for me, to remain invisible. But standing in that quiet place, I understood something different. My place was never meant to be under anyone's shadow. It had always been where honesty, effort, and quiet strength naturally led me. I did not need to fight for it anymore. It was something I had already earned by living through everything and still choosing to move forward. My parents were no longer part of my daily life. I knew they were dealing with the results of their own decisions, but I no longer carried anger about it. That chapter belonged to them, not me. I had let go of the need to understand or change what they believed. My focus was now on my work and the responsibilities I carried every day. I continued to serve in the courtroom, making decisions carefully, and fairly always remembering how important it was to treat people with respect. Every case reminded me that the small moments of kindness we extend to one another are often the things that change a life forever. I never took that responsibility lightly. I had been the invisible child once, and I knew exactly how much a single moment of being seen could mean. I did not feel the need to prove myself anymore. That pressure had slowly disappeared over time, replaced by a steady confidence that came from experience and growth. Before leaving the cemetery, I placed my hand gently on the headstone and thanked my grandmother for everything she had done for me, even when I did not understand it at the time. The stone was cool against my palm. The grass around it was a little longer than it should have been, as if no one had come in a while, and I made a quiet promise to come back more often. As I turned to leave, I remembered the words that had once followed me throughout my life. Know your place. For a moment, I smiled softly because I finally understood what those words meant. I looked back one last time and whispered, I finally do. Then I walked away, not carrying the past anymore, but carrying peace instead. The greatest change was not in how others saw me, but in how I finally saw myself, and nothing could take that away. Colin Cullen writing.